Okay, integrating governments, donors, and civil society into the process. A lot of the discussions yesterday, of course, focused on how USAID would respond, or how donors, the World Bank, other organizations are responding. But we shouldn't lose sight that it's actually the government that manages the policies in a country, all the way down to the local leaders, and that civil society needs to be part of that process. And a lot of the discussions, and this is a recurring problem we have with disaster risk reduction, a lot of the discussions focus on if we could just do this event, like build this or do that, then everything would work. And the point here is with positive deviation, that's a personal action, okay? And that's a very grassroots kind of thing in general. And so that's where we need to incorporate into this whole idea of a big structure of policy and ideas. RED, okay, take the microphone and somebody explain RED.
Reduction emissions. If you do this, I'll get it up. I could just stand up, okay. For those not familiar, reduction of emissions caused by deforestation and forest degradation. RED Plus is now the current discussion, because basically this is the reduction of emissions, but also enhancing carbon sequestration in these areas, and ideally having some sort of positive social benefit from doing this as well.
Thank you.
Kelly, you want to?
Good. So it's a team effort here, right? Okay. So more approaches really quickly. Use the pre-disaster period to incorporate climate issues into the disaster responses. As we always talk about, do disaster preparedness, planning, and nobody ever does it really, but we need to focus on incorporating climate issues into that. We need to learn how to, or you need to learn how to operate in uncertainty. We in the disaster business are always dealing with uncertainty. We don't know when the disaster is going to occur. We don't know how many people are affected. But when we put that into a development context, it's counterintuitive. The development context is very planned, but with climate issues, you're going to have a lot of uncertainty. We need open, common monitoring indicators, and this was something that was brought up by Niels yesterday, that different people are monitoring things and they're not sharing the information, so we really don't know what's happening in different places. We don't know the impacts, we don't know the problems. We have to integrate governments, donors, and civil society into the process, following on a point I made earlier. We already did RED. This slide seems to have repeated me. Right? Okay, anyway, we'll get to the bottom. Risk reduction and risk resilience. So these are very important. You have risk reduction, so you reduce the risk, but also you accept that some disasters will occur. Okay, so that's resilience. You can rebound, bounce back after the disaster. Risk reduction will not get rid of all possible disasters. And then we have the concept of no regrets, which is something that you'll talk about, right? No, I'm not talking about it. Not going to talk about that. Okay, so the idea is that when you're planning things in the future, you should look around and say, is this going to cause us to regret something in the future? Very simple concept, but it's often quite difficult to put in practice, and so it's something very useful. Okay, that was my summary. Go back to the last slide.
And my question is the typical setting carrying out all of this in terms of climate change. And disaster risk management. Use the pre-disaster period. Okay, that kind of starts this. How long does this go on? This is my question.
Well, actually, I could do a whole presentation on that. It's a circle.
Okay.
So what we refer to is you have a disaster, and then you have the response, the life-saving response, and longer-term recovery, and then you have disaster risk reduction activities, and some which include early warning or disaster planning or creating stockpiles, training people, et cetera, and then you have a disaster again. And somewhere in that, from the disaster event to the early warning, there's some policy thing that says you're going to reduce the likelihood of a disaster. For most climate-related disasters, it's not that hard. For earthquakes, it's very difficult because the earthquakes affect the built infrastructure. Okay, so in the case of Istanbul now, they have thousands, tens of thousands of houses, apartment houses, that they know will probably collapse in the next big earthquake in Istanbul. And it's just so expensive to tear the houses down and rebuild them properly or even retrofit them that they're sort of accepting that risk as something that they know is going to happen. Whereas with a lot of climate-related risks, because it's usually very site-specific and time-specific, you can say, okay, this is a flood zone, so let's move the people out of the flood zone. And you can do that usually fairly easily over time. But a lot of times people don't want to move because the flood zone has certain attributes to their livelihoods, which are very important. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, just clarify what is TSA response. I didn't capture that. And also, would you elaborate what do you mean by climate change is not a sector?
Okay, TSA, the Transport Safety Administration. Transport Safety Administration. The people who pat you down at the airport. Transportation Security. I'm sorry.
From the U.S., you may not know.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, and then the other one was, what was the other one?
Climate change is not a sector.
Climate change is not a sector. Okay. The point is that there's so many things that are going on related to climate change that it incorporates other sectors. Okay, so when we talk about, very simply, we talk about the shelter sector. We deal with shelter after disaster. Where you build shelter is very important. But the reasons that you might choose on a location to build shelter includes the climate, it includes a lot of other variables. Okay, so it's just not one thing. Whereas shelter itself incorporates all those other. So climate is part of shelter, but shelter is not really part of climate directly. So it's a bit of a complex kind of point because the climate will involve so many different aspects.
If I could also add something that we often speak about in USAID is to try to get the framework into that climate, that that's okay there, that climate change is a stressor and that it's a stressor. It's something that causes stress to a community, to infrastructure, to livelihood structures, and so on. So I think that's what Kelly was trying to capture is the idea that climate change is a stressor to many of our ways of engagement in a particular country, and we want to try to perhaps get away from it being seen as a sector. In a certain scenario, if I may, if it's seen as a sector, then it's only, for example, going to be addressed by the environmental community. Okay, so perhaps then only addressed by the ministries of environment. And then, as we all know, working in many countries in the developing world context, the Ministry of the Environment does not necessarily have the most power compared to ag, compared to health, compared to Ministry of Finance, and what have you. So rather that it is a stressor across many different sectors. Do you have a comment, ma'am?
Came to my mind when I saw that
Yeah, please.
climate change is not a sector. What immediately came to mind is that climate change is not a sector, but it is cross-sectoral and interdisciplinary. It covers virtually everything.
Yeah.
It is life.
But that's a very good point, and many people do refer to it as cross-sectoral, et cetera, et cetera. But as somebody involved in an organization that funds activities told me once, don't call it cross-sectoral because then it means somebody else is responsible for it. So that's part of the point about that was that it's not a sector, but if we call it cross-sectoral. So the challenge then, if I can elaborate, is now how to figure out how to address climate in all the other sectors in a way that's effective, to create a whole climate thing, but to avoid the words that tend to keep the funding from being available or keep people to pay attention to it. And I want to highlight, we have that problem with disaster risk reduction, which is called cross-sectoral, but that means that everybody else is responsible, not for the shelter person, not for the water and sanitation people. It's always somebody else that has to be responsible for it. And usually they put it back onto the disaster managers who have no means to deal with those issues because disaster risk reduction is inherent in all developmental activities. So it kind of bounces around. Climate change is very much the same situation.
We're all responsible for climate change.
Pardon me?
We are all responsible.
We are, yeah. But when you go to the bank to get the money, not this bank, but you go to the bank to get the money. I don't want to cut you off, but we were going to have the discussion after the two other presentations who will probably make things a lot clearer. Okay. So who wants to go? Go. Oops. Thanks a lot.
I actually am going to keep this very brief because I really would like to hear from the room. I think these types of engagements are a really nice opportunity for us to come together and get different perspectives. So I want to just talk very briefly, as the title suggests, about USAID's perspectives on this, and then two things that you should know about me in terms of background. I am an environmental compliance and environmental impact assessment professional. I'm responsible for the environmental compliance of this one particular bureau within USAID that covers humanitarian assistance, as Kelly's just been speaking about, but we are the Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance. And I also wear a hat of increasingly taking responsibility for our climate change adaptation work, although I also have my colleague Ed Carr at USAID supporting me in that vein in our Bureau. I do also want to let you know that I am a tree hugger, and I'm quite proud to be one, but I am in the context, as you can see, of this Bureau for humanitarian assistance, for conflict, immediate response, political transition initiatives. There's a lot going on in this bureau that, as you can imagine, the environment doesn't necessarily take the center stage. And so that's part of the challenge, to work within that construct of trying to raise some of these issues. So yes, Kelly did steal my highly sophisticated conceptual schematic here, but basically just to get at the idea of we're trying to look for engagements at that asterisk in the center, at that intersection point of humanitarian assistance, indeed considering the response, humanitarian response. If we use Haiti as the example, that zero earthquake time to about 1 month, 1 to 2 months outside of their immediate impact, but also the disaster risk reduction that Kelly went through, which lasts for a much longer period of time. Climate variability and change within USAID. Via our disaster risk reduction programs, we've been dealing with climate variability for 20 to 30 years. We're calling it climate change now in part because of increased phenomenons that we're learning about, but as well as it's a political thing in terms of funding. It just frankly comes down to that. I think a lot of you are dealing with that issue as well. And then this is IAIA, so of course the impact assessment is a piece that we want to see how it fits in as well. So again, just briefly, within the USAID climate change framework of mitigation, clean energy, sustainable landscapes, which is basically just our carbon sequestration, within adaptation, we're looking at, again, disaster risk response. Also in my bureau, we have a massive food aid program, Food for Peace, that some of you may be familiar with, which also more broadly works on food security, conflict mitigation, and democracy and governance. Very quickly, I just have 4 slides. This is kind of like speed dating, talking about, sorry, that's another cultural reference, but talking about just some of the things we're doing within our Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance concerning climate change mitigation.